Argentina should be rich. It has some of the most fertile land exporting food products around the world. It has an abundance of energy, industry, and human resources. Yet for decades, Argentines have lived with a constant anxiety that their money will not last. Prices rise quietly, then suddenly. Savings shrink between paydays. Currencies change names. Zeros are erased. Then it happens again. Argentina is not a country that suffered inflation once. It is a country that learned to live with it. To understand how inflation became normal, you have to begin with a fact that is now almost forgotten. Argentina was once wealthy. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina ranked one of the richest countries. Its income per person rivaled many parts of Europe. Buenos Aires was a global city, outward-looking, confident, and well-connected. The country exported beef and grain to global markets and imported capital, people, and ideas. The peso worked and held value over time. Contracts stretched years into the future. Savings mattered. Families planned. Businesses invested without fear that tomorrow would invalidate today's prices. Argentina was not unstable by nature. It was stable enough to take stability for granted. But that stability created expectations. As the country grew, the state was expected to provide. Living standards were expected to rise. Wages were expected to keep pace with modern life. When shocks arrived, such as global downturns, political crises, and external pressure, the pressure fell not on society to adjust, but on the government to act. Typically, governments, when cornered, look for painless solutions. At first, Argentina did what most states do. It taxed, it borrowed, spent. But the system was fragile. Tax collection was uneven. Politics was volatile. Institutions bent under pressure. When spending demands rose faster than revenue, gaps opened in the budget. Those gaps had to be filled. Raising taxes was unpopular, cutting spending was politically dangerous, and borrowing had limits. However, printing money by contrast seemed harmless. As no vote was required, no bill arrived in the post and voters would not object. But there is still a price, and the costs come later. The first rounds of money printing were modest. Prices rose, but not catastrophically. Wages adjusted, and people complained. Inflation felt irritating but not fatal. That mattered. Because inflation that can be endured becomes inflation that can be ongoing. Each time Argentina printed to cover a deficit, lessons were learned and the population adjusted. Confidence was tested but did not break. Politicians learned that inflation did not produce immediate collapse. The delay between cause and consequence created a sense of political safety. However, printing became an unhealthy habit. Over time, the peso began to change role. It stopped being something to hold and started being something to move. Salaries were gone quickly. Cash was converted into goods, dollars, or anything that would not lose value by next month. Shops adapted and prices were adjusted frequently. Contracts shortened and businesses hesitated to invest as costs could not be predicted. People adapted faster than institutions. The state noticed the symptoms but not the cause. When inflation reduced the real value of tax revenue, it printed more to compensate. When printing accelerated inflation, wages didn't keep up with the cost of goods. When wages chased prices, deficits widened. By this point, inflation was no longer an emergency measure. It was a policy reflex. Printing replaced taxation as the default response to pressure. Central bank independence weakened. Spending promises multiplied because the bill could always be deferred. Trust eroded before collapse arrived. This is the most dangerous phase of inflation. Not hyperinflation, panic, but normalization. When people expect prices to rise, they behave in ways that makes that happen. They spend faster, save less, and demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices preemptively. Currency weakens socially long before it collapses legally. Inflation becomes learned behavior. Argentina did not fall into inflation because it misunderstood economics. It fell into inflation because inflation worked. Each cycle taught the same lesson. Printing postponed pain. Each postponement made the next cycle worse. Over time, the state lost the ability to restore credibility because credibility depends on belief, and belief had been trained out of the system. By the time inflation became a crisis, it was already familiar, and why Argentina's problem is so persistent. Inflation is no longer just a policy failure, It is embedded memory and population behavior. The story of Argentina is not about one bad decision or one reckless government. It is about what happens when a society learns that money cannot be trusted and behaves accordingly. Once that lesson is learned, stability becomes extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Once inflation became familiar, it began to reshape behavior. Prices no longer moved once a year, they moved constantly. Shops adjusted labels weekly, then daily. Employers stopped offering long-term contracts. Wages were renegotiated again and again, not to get ahead, but simply to keep up. Money lost its patience. Peso was no longer something you saved for the future. It was something you escaped from. Salaries were spent quickly, sometimes immediately. Cash was turned into goods, appliances, construction materials. Anything that might hold value longer than paper. This was rational behavior. When money loses value over time, holding it becomes a mistake. Spending becomes essential, as tomorrow was always worse than today. Businesses adapted too. Long-term planning disappeared. Investment decisions shortened. Projects that required stable costs or predictable demand were postponed or abandoned. Instead of expansion, firms focused on survival. Pricing became defensive. Costs were passed on preemptively, not reactively. Inflation stopped being a number. It became an atmosphere. The state responded the only way it knew how. As prices rose, the real value of tax revenue fell. Inflation eroded the government's income faster than taxes could be collected. Budgets broke in real terms, even when they balanced on paper. To fill the gap, the state printed more money. This felt unavoidable. Printing was no longer about generosity or ambition. It was about keeping the system functioning. Salaries had to be paid. Subsidies had to be funded. Social peace had to be maintained. Every delay risked unrest. So printing accelerated. Each round of inflation weakened the peso further. Each weakening forced businesses and households to protect themselves. Each act of protection reduced trust in the currency. And as trust collapsed, inflation fed on expectation rather than supply. This is the moment when inflation becomes self-sustaining. People no longer wait for prices to rise, they assume they will. That assumption changes everything. Contracts shorten. Rents adjust. Loans demand inflation protection. Indexation spreads. The economy begins to run on moving targets. Stability disappears not because of chaos, but because nothing is allowed to stay still. The peso began to lose its social function. People did not need a law to abandon it. They did it instinctively. Dollars replaced pesos in savings. Foreign currency was used as a reference point for value, even when transactions still occurred locally. Prices were quoted in 2 units, one official and one real. Every failed stabilization taught the same lesson, that when promises expire faster than prices. This is why Argentina's reforms never held. Stability depends on belief, and belief depends on memory. Argentina's memory was full of broken pegs, erased zeros, frozen deposits, and sudden devaluations. Even good policies struggled because nobody trusted it to last. The peso was already socially dead. People did not need hyperinflation to abandon it. They abandoned it at the first sign of trouble. Capital fled early. Savings escaped instantly. Any shock was amplified by expectation. Inflation had become anticipatory. This is the final stage. When inflation is expected, it arrives faster than policy can respond. Even restraint feels dangerous. Governments hesitate. Central banks flinch. Printing resumes. The loop closes. Argentina did not suffer one inflation crisis. It suffered many and learned from all of them. That learning made the next crisis easier to trigger and harder to stop. Other countries have killed inflation, but Argentina struggled because its institutions never regained credibility long enough for trust to rebuild. Credibility is slow, and inflation is fast. Stabilization requires years of discipline. Printing undoes it in months. Political cycles are short. Social patience is limited. The cost of reform arrives immediately. The benefit arrives later, if at all. Each government faced the same dilemma. Impose discipline and absorb pain now, or print and survive today. The system rewarded the second choice. Over time, inflation stopped being a failure of policy and became a feature of politics. Expectations adjusted downward. Growth stalled. Investment disappeared. The economy became defensive. Argentina did not collapse dramatically. It eroded. This is why Argentina matters beyond its borders. Inflation is not just a monetary phenomenon, it is a psychological one. As people stop trusting money, policy becomes less effective. Printing works briefly, then backfires. Controls buy time, then fail. Reforms succeed temporarily, then unravel. Inflation leaves scars, and those scars change behavior long after the original crisis is gone. Argentina's story is not about incompetence, it is about a path to dependence. Each cycle made the next more likely. Each rescue weakened credibility further. Each shortcut trained the system to expect shortcuts. The country did not print itself poor overnight. It printed away trust, slowly, repeatedly, and rationally. And once trust is gone, money becomes just paper. That is why Argentina's inflation keeps returning. Not because the country does not know what to do, but because it remembers what happened last time. Trust migrated, not through official collapse, but through quiet avoidance. The government tried to stop this with capital controls. Currency restrictions tightened, making access to dollars restricted. But controls do not create trust. They signal its absence. Black markets emerged. Parallel exchange rates appeared. The gap between official prices and real prices widened. Everyone understood the difference. Everyone acted accordingly. Inflation was no longer just economic. It was cultural. Children grew up knowing money was temporary. Adults learned to think in foreign currencies. Businesses learned to hedge constantly. Politicians learned that stabilization caused pain faster than printing ever did. This was the cruel paradox. Stopping inflation required discipline, credibility, and time. Printing avoided pain today at the cost of pain tomorrow, as tomorrow was always someone else's problem. Each attempted stabilization reset expectations briefly, then failed. Prices slowed, then surged again. Every failure taught the same lesson: do not trust promises. By now, inflation was no longer a shock. It was a powerful memory. When people expect inflation, they behave in ways that creates it. When everyone behaves that way, even good policy struggles to succeed. Stability becomes fragile. Any mistake, shock, or political shift brings inflation roaring back. Argentina was no longer trapped by ignorance, it was trapped by experience. The country had learned what inflation felt like, and it had learned how to survive it. But survival came at a cost. Long-term growth disappeared. Investment fled. Money still circulated, but trust was lost. By this stage, inflation was no longer a temporary failure of policy. It was embedded behavior, shared by households, businesses, and the state itself. The peso still existed, but it no longer anchored the economy. That role had been lost. By the time Argentina reached this stage, inflation was no longer driven by a single policy mistake. It was driven by feedback. Every part of the system was now reacting to every other part. As inflation accelerated, the real value of taxes collapsed. Governments collected revenue slowly, but prices moved fast. By the time money reached the treasury, it bought less than expected. Budgets that looked balanced on paper were broken in reality. To close the gap, the state printed. Printing increased the money supply and weakened the peso. A weaker peso pushed prices higher. Higher prices reduced real tax revenue further. And once again, the solution was printing. This was no longer a choice, it was survival. Politicians did not print because they believed inflation was good. They printed because the alternative was immediate collapse with unpaid wages, unfunded subsidies, and political unrest. Printing delayed crisis, discipline accelerated it. This is how inflation becomes trapped in the system. Each cycle trained everyone involved. Households learned to spend quickly. Businesses learned to raise prices preemptively. Workers demanded constant wage adjustments. Investors fled. The state learned that credibility was fragile and pain was immediate. Short-term politics always won. Attempts at reform did arrive. Again and again, new currencies were introduced. Pegs were announced. Central bank independence was promised. Spending was cut. Inflation slowed. Confidence flickered. Then something went wrong. Sometimes it was a recession. Sometimes an election. Sometimes an external shock. Sometimes nothing dramatic at all. But each time pressure returned. And when pressure returned, so did printing.